So I'm excited to today feature one of our really long-standing and very committed Florida invasive species partnership partners, the Florida Department of Transportation, and kind of what they do and their role in regards to invasive species, but as well as some of the habitat management stuff that they do. And so we have Jeff Norsini. He's a private consultant with native wildflower expertise in established and management of sustainable plantings, seed dormancy and germination, and production. And he's been under contract with DOT since July 2013. Prior to that, he was faculty at the University of Florida IFAS at the North Florida Research and Education Center in Quincy from 1987 to 2009. And has a background in biology and horticulture. So super excited to have Jeff with us today to learn more about and better understand kind of what FDOT's role in all of this is. So Jeff, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, let me just share the screen and just let me get this right. Slideshow beginning.
While we're getting that up, I hope everybody we're in the midst of some weather rolling across the state. So hope everyone.
Is that showing up now correctly, Emily?
Looks good.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you. Yeah, there is some weather and it just passed through here in Tallahassee. We've had morning rain and thunders and all that. Luckily, it wasn't bad stuff like they had further west. But anyway, we needed the rain and we got it. Thank you, first of all, for that good introduction. I appreciate it. Since there are 3 DOT programs I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to just be providing an overview of those programs. So there's a little more information about wildflowers, since that is my specialty. First one I'll delve into is DOT's invasive species program. With roadside right-of-ways, DOT's the Florida DOT must deal with, it's dealing with its disturbed habitat, which makes it susceptible to infestation by invasives. And they can spread on the right-of-way by seeds or rhizomes attached to the mowers, construction equipment, and even wheels of DOT or contractor vehicles. They can also spread from adjacent lands, as you're well aware. To address this, eradication of 2 of the most common invasives, Brazilian pepper and Cogongrass, is included in maintenance contracts. Eradication of tropical soda apple is also included. The Turnpike system keeps track of Cogongrass locations by mapping it annually. And now DOT is producing 2 computer-based training modules about identifying invasives under roadside conditions. This is just a screenshot of the Cogongrass map that the Turnpike system uses. And notice there's 2 different dot colors. The different colors are used for different parts of the Turnpike system. And if you scroll over each dot, you'll get details about each infestation. So it's a really valuable resource for looking for Cogongrass on the Turnpike system and where it is and how it's being treated. In 2021, DOT started working on training modules aimed at their personnel as well as contractors. As we all know, the key to managing any unwanted vegetation on the roadside is to first identify it. So in these training modules, the focus is on where does the invasive occur in Florida, typical habitat, and just the key idea characteristics, especially under roadside conditions. For example, Japanese climbing fern, which once mainly occurred in the Panhandle in North Florida, and now expanded its range all the way into South Florida. Although when I was in South Florida, I saw very little of it. I saw none of it, as a matter of fact. Although according to one expert, it's the old world climbing fern is definitely more common, and that's what I would say too. When I was in Central and South Florida, did not see any Japanese climbing fern, but I did see a bunch of old world climbing fern. And in these training modules, we also note the typical habitat For example, torpedo grass typically occurs in moist or wet areas like the edges of ponds and retention basins. And key ID characteristic roadsides are also pointing out, including the growth habit. For example, as we all know, climbing ferns typically are found growing in trees and other vegetation. However, in the Apalachicola National Forest, I saw Japanese climbing fern occurring in 2 unmowed areas around roadside culverts. Now, while these 2 locations were on a county road, it's certainly possible that this might occur on a state maintained road as well. So that was really interesting when I saw it here on, around the culvert. And they did have the fertile and fertile fronds on there, so it is spreading. And then in these training modules, I point out key ID characteristics as noted here for climbing ferns, the way to differentiate them, whether they be the vegetative fronds or the fertile fronds. And there's 2 training modules being produced. One is which is being finished up now, and I shot the video for it in 2021. And in 2021, I recorded videos and photos in May and June, and I'll show you that list of species in a minute. Then I sent the photos and the videos, plus a script with timestamps included for the videos to the FDOT, the media group. I also included links to videos produced by the Center of Aquatic and Invasive Plants. And for me to locate these, I mainly used EdMaps to locate them, which was a mixed blessing. While helpful, often plants were not there because DOT or a contractor had eradicated them, which is good. So I often had to resort to looking for plants based on places where they occur. And then one of the limitations I had both in last year and this year is that budget constraints limit the recording of, it's limiting the recording of video and photos to the spring. So I have to sometimes rely on other sources for the photos of fruit and inflorescences. And here's a list of the 8 species I covered in 2021. And this training module should be out soon. And for the 2022, this is the list of species. And I've developed this list based on input from the DOT vegetation managers in each of the districts. And if anyone knows of any specific locations of any of these on state roadsides, well, let's say locations of any of these, roadside is a roadside, especially within the past year or so, please let me know. I have found with EdMaps, if the location's more than a year old, it's probably been eradicated. That was especially the case with the climbing fern, the Japanese climbing fern. It was very difficult to find that. It had been eradicated. And I will have my contact information at the end of the presentation. Now moving on to the wildflower program, which is my specialty. The program began in the early 60s, and it began completely by accident. A road contractor had purchased sod for a roadside from a farmer who had sown the sod with crimson clover for cattle forage. Once the crimson clover emerged on the roadside sod, drivers began calling FDOT inquiring about the attractive wildflowers. So DOT began planting crimson clover, and in 1963, they officially began their wildflower program, and has been going on since for nearly 60 years. So it's a complete accident. And this is, there's a picture of the crimson clover. There's over 12,000 miles on the state highway system, includes both state and federal highways. About 64,000 acres of that is in turf grass, and that's based on the national average. There's about roughly 3,000 to 4,000 acres of wildflowers. That includes sites planted with native and non-native species. The species you see there is Coreopsis leavenworthii, which is nearly endemic to Florida. I know it does occur in a couple counties in Alabama, but it basically only occurs here. There's also naturalized areas of non-native species. Shown here are mainly Coreopsis basalis, and Phlox drumondii, which are very common non-native species that have not naturalized widely in the Big Bend region. They both put on showy displays in the spring and are very attractive to pollinators. And the pink and purple phlox is very common along I-75 into Central Florida. Much of that is naturalized. And if you see red phlox on the roadside, it's definitely planted. Even though some of the multicolored phlox is planted, a lot of it has just naturalized. There's also areas of naturally occurring natives like Salvia lyrata, the lyre-leaf sage, in the spring. Such areas can be designated as wildflower areas by DOT, but they need to be informed so that they can consider designating such areas as wildflower areas. So there's a lot of these areas around that aren't designated at this point, but if DOT knows about it, they may go ahead and mark it off so they can implement appropriate mowing practices for those wildflower areas where there's naturally occurring natives. As in this case, this is naturally occurring natives in the Panhandle, and they eventually designated it a wildflower area. And there are wildflower areas that are remnants of native plant communities. Some are showy like this along the Turnpike, and some are less showy. Creating wildflower areas where there are naturally occurring natives or native plant community remnants are the most cost-efficient methods of establishing wildflower areas, provided there's no invasives or aggressive weeds that occur there. It's simply a matter of timing mowing to flowering and seed set, and so the sites become more sustainable. So you've got perfectly adapted native wildflowers and native grasses to a site. All you have to do is basically stay off of them so they flower and set seed, and sometimes they don't need mowing more than once a year at the most, maybe once every other year to prevent encroachment of woodies. But these are a very cost-efficient way of establishing wildflower areas. Just a couple notes about establishing wildflower areas by seed. From the 1963 at the beginning to the early 2000s, wildflower areas were established with seed from the large national wildflower seed producers. And then around 2003, use of Florida ecotype wildflower seed was encouraged. And the reason for using Florida ecotype wildflower seed was that it's better adapted to Florida's environment than something that's coming from out of state. I've even done some research on this. For example, on the right side, you see Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Susan. I did some research with that using a North Florida ecotype and a Texas ecotype, essentially a Texas ecotype. And while the Florida ecotype was not quite as showy, it had much longer flowering and much better survivability than the seed that was obtained from Texas. So there is some research to back that up for sure. Although the one drawback of using Florida ecotype seed, we have a relatively small seed industry here in Florida. So the seed is quite expensive. So that's one of the drawbacks of using that type of seed. And that's one of the reasons I think the easiest way or the most cost-efficient way for establishing wildflower areas on roadsides is to just preserve the areas that we already have that have naturally occurring native wildflowers. And it's just a matter of designating those areas and timing the mowing to flowering and seed set. DOT has an official procedure that details how their wildflower program is to function and be implemented. DOT, as well as its contractors, are strongly encouraged to use IVM practices with the emphasis on reduced mowing and to recognize that these practices benefit pollinators and other beneficial insects. And part of that procedure is that each district has a designated wildflower coordinator. There are 8 districts. The one that's missing from that map is District 8, which is the Turnpike system, which spans parts of actually 5, 7, 1, 4, and 6. And as I noted before, reduced mowing is part of that procedure, whether that be a narrower mowing swath, reduced mowing frequency, or a combination of those two methods. This is on State Route 65 in Liberty County. And they've been doing reduced mowing there a long time, and it's really benefited the native wildflowers there. Reduced mowing, whether the frequency or the area mowed, can provide substantial cost savings when considered on a statewide basis. Even a small % reduction in mowing cost when compounded over thousands of acres results in substantial cost savings. And reduced mowing has substantial ecological benefits as well. It increases the value of ecosystem services provided by the vegetation. It conserves fuel, and it can increase pollinator habitat. Now, a lot of advantages to reduced mowing. And reduced mowing can lead to more wildflowers, but only in appropriate sites. If it's weedy or it's got invasives, it's certainly not a good place to implement reduced mowing. I've seen areas on the Turnpike, they had beautiful natives, the orchids, the leafless beak orchid mixed in with some orchids and black-eyed Susan and other plants like that. And growing amongst that was Cogongrass. So even though it was beautiful, it's an area that was never going to work. I do want to point out where something like this does work to reduce mowing. The one on the upper left where the Indian blanket is, or Gaillardia pachella, which I realize is no longer considered native as of early 2021. But back when I did this was several years ago. This is along A1A. I believe it's Volusia County in District 5. I was out with the wildflower coordinator, and we were looking for naturally occurring native wildflowers. And this area in April just looked like a regular mowed area, but when we passed by it, it was obvious that there was a lot of Indian blanket growing there, but there was a lot of the gray-green foliage. So we got out, we looked around, and just about everywhere I looked, that's about all I saw was Indian blanket. And so I asked the coordinator and said, and this was back in April of one year, I said, just stay off of it and let's see what happens. And this is what it looked like in July. So just a burst of blanket flower. And they're continuing to do reduce mowing in areas like this. While it's not native, it's still a great pollinator plant. The photo on the bottom center is along State Route 65 in the Apalachicola National Forest, which by far and away there's a 30-mile stretch where there's reduced mowing. It's the best wildflower area in the state by far, maybe even the lower south. But from spring through fall, there's stunning displays of wildflowers and native grasses. This happens to be parrot pitcher plants in flower with the yellow colic roots sticking up above it. It's just stunning. And if you want to see pitcher plants, State Route 65 is the place to see it, and in the spring. Soon, or if not now, just within the next few weeks, they'll all be flowering. There's several species of pitcher plants along there. And it's places you need to park, find a safe place to park and just walk and be amazed what you see. And then another area on the right is Coreopsis leavenworthii, District 2. This is in Levy County. They've done a good job. This was all naturally occurring, and through reduced mowing, there's large patches of Leavenworth Coreopsis along State Route 27 in Levy County, just by reduced mowing. So there's just 3 examples what can happen with reduced mowing in appropriate areas.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
So real quick, we had a question come in pertinent to this. What was the motive for frequent mowing in the past? So you say they do reduced mowing. Why don't they just reduce mowing everywhere?
Well, in urban areas, there's a high demand for a neatly maintained landscape. So it's only going to work in rural areas where there's less of an expectation for more of a neat landscape. But in urban landscapes, there's definitely a high need for frequent mowing to make it look neat. And that's been the mindset. The mindset for many years was, let's make the roadsides look like our front yards. And so there was a lot of mowing. And now we're seeing some of the advantages of reduced mowing. And the mowing's not necessarily needed in some cases, but it depends on the contract. Some areas, especially urban areas, there's a high demand for a lot of mowing to keep it looking neat. And in all these wildflower areas, I always recommend it. Well, there's always has to be, a safety strip for cars to be, or any vehicle to pull over safely. The other advantage of a safety strip, it defines the planting. So it looks like you're not just staying off of it, but there's a reason you're staying off it, because sometimes you have, flowers like this occurring. But each maintenance district, while there's guidelines for mowing, each maintenance district has the ability to do more, set their standards essentially for how often things are mowed. Overall, there has been a reduction in mowing over the past several years, which I've been glad to see. But it's in urban environments, there's just going to be a higher demand for that neat looking landscape. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I also want to talk about a new aspect of DOT's wildfire program, and that's the Monarch CCAA, which is the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. As most of you are aware, the Monarch is an imperiled butterfly that was considered for listing as an endangered species by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And DOT is taking a proactive approach to aiding the Monarch by entering into the Monarch CCAA, which is a nationwide effort being led by the Energy Resource Center at the University of Chicago in Illinois. And the CCAA for the Monarch is a formal agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, where landowners, in this case, it's utility companies and departments of transportation, they voluntarily commit to address the conservation needs of the Monarch. And what the CCAAs are essentially, they're developed for candidate species before they're officially listed under the Endangered Species Act. In return for signing on to the CCAA, the DOT and the other Florida DOT, as well as the other DOTs and the utility companies, they receive regulatory certainty that no measures beyond those outlined in the agreement would be required of them for covered activities if the species were to become listed. So that regulatory certainty is really important reason. It minimizes the potential for delays. It gives you that statewide consistency. And then you have the support being provided by the UIC in Chicago, University of Illinois in Chicago. Now, by joining the Monarch Butterfly CCAA, DOT is required to identify what rights of way to enroll into the agreement, and they have to perform conservation measures on at least 8% of those enrolled acres. They also have to track when and where those measures are performed, do monitoring on the right of way, and then submit annual reports to the UIC as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service. So what are those conservation measures? Just some examples listed here of what DOT may choose to do. They could choose to do all of them or just one of them. It doesn't really matter, so long as the conservation measures are performed on at least 8% of the total enrolled acres. It can include reduced mowing, whether that's frequency or the swath of mowing, controlling invasive species, including idle lands, which are lands that are, for example, would not, like inundated ditches that aren't going to get mowed. And so there's more native plants there that would be allowed to flower, planting pollinator-friendly plants, and or preventing encroachment of woody plants into open areas, or just removing brush to further expand open areas. And I do want to mention, as most of you know, talk about the milkweeds just a little bit because they're important to monarchs because they're larval host plants. And I mention these because many of you are out in the field. So if you come across, not one or two of these, but decent sized populations where they can really make an impact on monarchs, it'd be good to inform DOT, a local DOT office, or even me if necessary. One, and I'm just going to point out the most common ones, one of which is pine woods milkweed. It only occurs in North Florida and down into Central Florida, which is the limit of its range. You'll most likely see this on back slopes in sunny, dry areas, which are sandy. It should be blooming probably April, mid-April, early May. And it's a very important larval plant for monarchs, especially in North Florida, as they fly north from Mexico. Now, it's really easy to spot on the roadside because it has this purplish green foliage, even if it's not flowering. This really sticks out. And normally, you're going to find these in natural, a lot of times in native plant community remnants, and so these just really stick out. Large foliage, purplish, easy to pick out. Another common one most of you are familiar with is the butterfly milkweed. Sometimes you'll see it like this, a whole bunch of flowers, and sometimes you'll see it as singly. It occurs throughout the state in dry, sunny sites, usually on the back slope and beyond, and it blooms in very late spring or summer, but it's easy to pick out with its really bright orange foliage, bright orange flower. And the two other common ones are ones that occur in either moist to wet areas or even inundated areas. I've seen both of those growing in standing water. The swamp milkweed and the few flower milkweed. They both start flowering in late spring through summer. I've seen the swamp milkweed grow away until full shade, so they can occur anywhere, full shade to full sun. A lot of times they'll find it growing in standing water. The few flower milkweed, very easy to pick out in wet areas. That's about as dense a dense of occurrence that I've ever seen. But they're very easy to pick out. You've got these bright orange flowers, and they're basically on the end of a 2 to 3 or 4 foot, maybe even 5 foot stick. They just stick up, and a lot of times you'll just see one little cluster of flowers, and they're very easy to pick out. If it's a wet area and you see this, it's almost certainly the few flower milkweed. So that's probably the easiest one to pick out, plus they're so prominent in wet areas. And one other plant I wanted to mention besides the milkweeds, and this is an important nectar plant for the monarchs, as well as other bees and butterflies. I've never seen one that isn't just covered with bees and butterflies or is some kind of a pollinator. Because of its importance to monarchs, it's no longer an FDOT prohibited plant. It used to be, but they've taken it off that list. It's ubiquitous. It's one that and I'm sure many of you, others of you have. I have love-hate feelings for it. I love its attractiveness to a wide variety of pollinators. But then you've got the seeds, where actually achenes, which are fruit, and never fails that I walk into a patch of this and don't realize it until I come out and I'm covered with seeds. So it's a great nectar plant for just pollinators in general, but the monarchs love it. But you've got the seeds, just be careful. But anyway. And then finally, with the wildflowers, I do want to mention that DOT partners with the Florida Wildflower Foundation in support of creating wildflower areas and pollinator habitat. In counties that have officially adopted a wildflower resolution, county commissions can make formal requests to DOT to create wildflower areas, whether that wildflower area is comprised of naturally occurring natives, whether it's a native plant community remnant, or the county wants simply to have a site seeded with native wildflowers or grasses. This program was started in 2009 by foundation members Eleanor Dietrich and Jeff Castor as a way for counties to promote wildflowers through conservation and planting. And just I'll give you an overview of the landscape program. This is DOT's, in bold print, is their policy with regard to landscape beautification and conservation, which part of that policy, they're meant to enforce that policy by accommodating existing and proposed trees and other long-lived plants by consistently integrating landscape conservation, and highway beautification into the processes that are used to plan, design, construct, and maintain roadways. And by utilizing design strategies that enhance Florida's distinctive sense of place and create lasting curb appeal and minimizing the cost to conserve and maintain these high quality landscapes. And I do want to mention bold landscaping that some of you may have heard of. It was implemented about 9 to 10 years ago, with the emphasis being on large trees, especially palms, because that's what people expect when they come to Florida. And these were in these bold landscapes were in high visibility sites and meant to provide a welcoming experience for those who travel to Florida. However, that has now been de-emphasized. So the DOT has de-emphasized the use of palms and other plants that are expensive to establish and have long-term care issues, like these palms that are susceptible to lethal decline. And I was particularly concerned several years ago when the lethal bronzing, which was formerly known as TPPD, came out because of the susceptibility of cabbage palms to TPPD. However, when Brian Bader gave his presentation earlier this year about the lethal decline of palm, they're less susceptible than I had realized. So I was glad to see that. But that was my initial concern, not so much because of these palms, but because of the susceptibility of cabbage palm to lethal bronzing. Current designs with landscape designs are done so they are relatively inexpensive to maintain and treat trees as long-term elements that can be mowed around. And they also utilize thick mulch to reduce the need for weeding and avoiding large garden-like beds that require a lot of expensive hand weeding. And you can see an area like this, minimize hand weeding because of the mulch, and everything else can be mowed around. It makes it easy to maintain while still looking nice. Canopy trees are being used at interchanges now instead of just decorating interchanges with ornamentals. Rest areas are designed to provide a scenic and calming effect for visitors to the rest areas. Landscapes along shorelines are not only designed for scenic beauty, but to stabilize the shoreline as well. And forests existing forests are being used as part of the managed landscape. So taking advantage of what we have there naturally, just like wildflowers that occur naturally. And increased use of natives. As a colleague of mine pointed out, this is a really simple landscape, with the magnolias, the pines, and the palms. Very simple, beautiful, and easy to maintain. Minimal hand weeding there, easy to maintain around that just by mowing. Which brings me to the final points I want to make, especially about cities, towns, and counties, and their ability to work with FDOT with respect to landscaping. They can have a say in what's planted on the roadsides, but it's important that they provide input during the design process. And for example, if there's certain types of trees and shrubs already being used by a city, town, or county, they need to inform DOT so that they can design landscaping consistent with that. And FDOT will try to accommodate them as best they can. However, it's imperative that cities, towns, or counties get involved early in the design process so that engineers can design above and below ground elements to accommodate the desired plants. And often an MOU may be required for maintenance. As I show in this example, this is Capitol Circle Southeast in Tallahassee. DOT did a beautiful job of installing this landscape, but the city maintains it. And whenever I drive this, everything looks perfect. You never see weeds. It always looks great. So the city's doing a very good job of maintaining several mile stretch of Capitol Circle Southeast, maintaining these landscapes and keeping them weed free and looking good. And then highway beautification, there's a grant program for cities, towns, and counties. They can be awarded tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. It does require commitment on their part, and sometimes that commitment can be as simply as in-kind contributions, or sometimes there's in-kind matching funds. And usually an MOU is required between the DOT and the city, town, or county for maintenance. But they are out there, and this has been a popular program. And as I recall, it's 10 or 12 of these get funded every year, and some in, easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's out there every year. You can contact DOT to find out more information about that. And I just want to thank, just a few final notes. For those of you who are out in the field, try to keep DOT informed when you see invasives on state or federal highway roadsides. And if you see stands of native wildflowers or remnants of native plant communities. I like getting out there, but sometimes it's hard for me to get out there. But if you see these, just let us know, because they may be worth, if you see these native wildflowers or remnants of native plant communities, it's something that might be able to designate a wildflower area. And or if you see invasives out there, it's good to know. And so the local maintenance office can be informed, so they can contact the people that need to eradicate those. Or if you see invasives on land adjacent to a state or federal highway. And and I do want to recognize and thank Ed O'Daniels. He's a Cogongrass coordinator for the Longleaf Alliance, who has kept me informed about Cogongrass infestations in the Panhandle that occur on state roadsides or land adjacent to roadsides. And when he lets me know, I let District 3 know, and they're pretty responsive to that. So it's been a good relationship with Ed. And for any FDOT personnel viewing this webinar, I encourage you to stay in touch with the CISMA in your part of the state. And here is my contact information. Just one point, if you call my cell and your number is not in my contact list, it will go right to voicemail. So please leave a voicemail if you text me. Well, or if you call, just leave a voicemail message. Any questions?
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, we've had a few questions come in the chat box. So anyone, if you have any additional questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll go through there. Let's see. One question that came in: have you had any success treating for invasives and then reseeding with wildflowers, or is this
hold on, let me get to my video here. Let me get to here. Okay.
Or is the seed bank?
I'll tell you what, I do not recommend planting in areas with invasives. Maybe where there's tropical soda apple, this is simply a matter of digging them up, but I don't recommend planting any place near invasives, just because there may be a seed bank. And with planting wildflowers, it's the seed bank that's going to be the major issue, not what you see, it's what's below ground. So if there's invasives in that area, even if they've been eradicated, I would wait several years to make sure they're completely gone, because if you get invasives into an area that you want to seed with wildflowers, you can end up having to wipe out that wildflower area. So I wait at least a few years after you think it's eradicated, just to make sure there's no rhizomes that are popping, generating new plants or popping up from seed. I would definitely wait, not right away. And I am not aware of any place that DOT has planted wildflowers where they've had invasives. Not unless it's a complete restoration effort.
Gotcha, thanks. I have a question. Does DOT have an official policy regarding the cleaning of equipment that moves around the state?
I talked to John about this. I think there is, and I'd have to ask John, but I as I recall, because I asked him that question, and I think that may even be in contracts that they have to wash their equipment. I believe there is. I don't know I'm pretty sure there is. And that is one of the ways they move around. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other questions? Again, you can pop in the chat box, or at this point, you're welcome to also unmute and ask. I guess my last question is, you mentioned kind of letting y'all know when you see things on roadsides. Are the sites that are designated wildflower areas, is there a map available online or something where you can check?
No, the only part, I know District 8 maps their wildflower areas. You'd have to contact each district. You'd have to contact each wildflower coordinator in each district to find out where their wildflower areas are. They are signed around the state. The DOT, District 8, the Turnpike system does have a map of all their locations, but that's the only district I think that's actually made a publicly available map of all their locations. And there are a lot of good areas on the Turnpike, especially in Central Florida, north and south of Yeehaw junctions. So some beautiful stands of natives on those wide right-of-ways.
Sure. I guess I do have one last question. So in related to mapping, and I think you touched on this really briefly with the invasive plant section, but how does DOT, or how do y'all prioritize where you're doing invasive plant management? Are you regularly checking things like EdMaps?
They're meant to, well, I know in the contracts they're meant to check. I know they're meant to eradicate when they see them. I don't know how good a job they do of actually checking on it. I know the Turnpike system does an excellent job of mapping them. Plus, when I talked to Andrew Seibel, the vegetation management person there, he said they're annually mapping all their sites. They're doing the best job, and Cogongrass is so hard to control. It pops up all over the place. But from what I've seen, they do a good job of it. I just don't know what they're required to do. I know they're required to eradicate it. At least those three, the tropical soda apple, Cogongrass, and Brazilian pepper, although there's a lot of Brazilian pepper out there too.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's some variability across districts.
That's my impression. They're really stretched thin, and I know they do the best they can. I do know a lot of the state roadsides are under asset maintenance contracts, and I don't know how they're judged on that. But they are subject to the maintenance rating program, and if it's found, I'm sure they're informed. But it's up to the contract people at DOT to enforce that. But I'm sure they're doing the best they can. I have no doubt about that.
For sure. Got it. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.